there was this Doherty scenario, which was a worst case scenario, saying that there might be 25,000 deaths if we did nothing, right? So it really was assuming no action and worst case. How was that interpreted, though, by National Cabinet and by your colleagues?
When I dared to put an alternative view in very early April, this is 2020, not 2021, my warnings were regarded as contemptuous and frankly destructive. And we were constantly reminded that, had we not taken the farrago of policy options we had, we could have faced this apocalyptic scenario, which really aided incumbent government to simply hold the line, to keep spending, to keep limiting the number of opportunities to fly back into the country, limiting movement, introducing mandates. All of this was basically just swept through without any scientific support.
G'day and welcome to The Other Side Interviews, our weekly interview show that streams every Tuesday night at 6 p.m. on ADH TV and is on demand for you to watch or listen to anytime you like on ADH or your favourite podcast platform. I'm Damien Curry, and tonight's guest is a former federal MP in the Morrison government, a medical doctor and a management consultant. He holds a Master's in Public Administration from the Harvard Kennedy School of Government and is an obstetrician. This man has the perfect mix of skills to analyse the way that we handled COVID as a nation and what we should be learning from it. And that's exactly what Dr. Laming has done in a new book that he's released called Political COVID: How Australia's Leadership Played the Pandemic. Andrew Laming, welcome to The Other Side Interviews.
Damien, it's great to be with you from Cairns, and at the risk of clinical overreach, I'm a GP obstetrician, which is very different to the specialist obstetricians out there, and my regards to them looking after the mums around the country.
Sorry for falsely promoting you there, Andrew. Apologies for that. It is an impressive resume, though, and you do have the right mix of skills to do this analysis. Let's go back to February 2020. You were in the UK at Westminster. Were you there for COVID analysis? So what was the official reason for that trip?
For sure, Damien. I'd already identified a threat. I saw the UK as an appropriate wing companion economy to see how they managed the disease. And already there are 450 deaths compared to 150 in Australia, so per capita about the same. It was worth following. I bumped into Theresa May, tried to identify the concerns the UK held, and it was clear that, like Australia, they had no idea what was to come. At the time, they were asking, is this a V, a U, or a W depression coming? And that was we were thinking economically more so than clinically at that point.
Right. You say in the book that the first wave of COVID in the UK was not even close to exponential, meaning it wasn't being transmitted at a very fast and increasing rate, right?
Correct. It was, as has been described, a phenate spread, where potentially one super spreader might pass it to 5 or 6 others, but only 2 of those would transmit it, and possibly only to one person. So this sort of leapfrogging disease was evident in our Chinese data in January. It had been modelled by February, and by March I was publicly stating on Twitter that the first wave in Australia was likely to only last 3 to 4 weeks. I was within 2 days of being correct. And so the point was we had to avoid not being cautious, but also avoid overreaction and introduce science as soon as we had the evidence. And sadly, it didn't happen. And as I point out in the book, it's mostly because politicians faced with uncertainty will usually make decisions based on political grounds, in this case at the expense of the medical evidence.
So, Andrew, just to be clear, you believe it was clear to you within days, right, that looking at that UK data, and you had enough data at that point, and that was early March or late February, that within days you were fairly sure that this was not going to increase exponentially. And you came back to Australia, tried to alert people in March when the first wave came, and you said that by March 28 you had sufficient trend data to model both the peak and decline of new cases. What did that analysis tell you?
It was a little later than my return from the UK. I returned on the day the international borders closed,
Right,
coincidentally.
okay.
But by the end of March, it was Australian and in particular Queensland data I was modelling, and I could see it levelling out. So I was prepared to say that before the public health hierarchy was. And I simply pointed out that by Anzac Day, I'd expect states, particularly the Premier in Queensland, to be lifting restrictions. And she did the day after Anzac Day. So from that point, it should have been a watch and wait. It should have been the sensible, cost-free interventions and really questioning the super expensive ones like locking down economies and truckloads of money going out to businesses and individuals if they weren't in an area that was likely to have an outbreak. And what we saw was this flat rate approach to the entire country using policy trucked out of Treasury that had no scrutiny from parliamentarians before being implemented. And, sadly, I'm critical of some of my best friends and colleagues in that we bought into Treasury's belief that we had to effectively empty the coffers to be like we were in the GFC to respond quickly. But politicians, once the policy's in place, we find it very hard to unwind them, both because we're addicted to financial transfers and voters are, but also a rollback is seen as a backflip. And politicians really hate changing a policy until they really have to, and that's an unfortunate element of political life. We really needed to be identifying that modelling by Doherty that was predicting a number of outcomes, one of which was 25,000 deaths, would be latched onto by the politicians. But in reality, that was the do-nothing scenario if we didn't do anything to prevent COVID spread, patently ridiculous.
Okay, so I want to pause on that, Andrew. I want to pause on that because that's a critical point. There was this Doherty scenario, which was a worst-case scenario, saying that there might be 25,000 deaths if we did nothing, right? So it really was assuming no action and worst case. How was that interpreted, though, by National Cabinet and by your colleagues?
Well, for the non-clinical amongst us, we took it as gospel. We regarded Doherty with enormous respect, if not reverence. But when I dared to put an alternative view in very early April, this is 2020, not 2021, my warnings were regarded as contemptuous and frankly destructive. And we were constantly reminded that, had we not taken the farrago of policy options we had, we could have faced this apocalyptic scenario, which really aided incumbent government to simply hold the line, to keep spending, to keep limiting the number of opportunities to fly back into the country, limiting movement, introducing mandates. All of this was basically just swept through without any scientific support, on the basis that had we not done it, we'd have an apocalyptic outcome. And I guess I point out in the book that we had the highest levels of federal advice coming into AHPPC, the medical experts, but the states themselves just wrote their own evidence out of their little departments of health. And so if you left-wing leaning, if I may say it, it's a race to the bottom in these departments of public health where there's no points for being optimistic or missing a potential outbreak. And so these public health providers of evidence to state governments basically took the worst case scenario and supported politicians too closely. They became symbiotic in their relationship. And what we lost was real-time, transparent, independent medical advice. And this is one of the 5 sins of Australia's COVID management that I point out in the book. In
crisis management, there is a saying, and viewers and listeners of this show know that my background is in crisis management and communications. But there's a saying: you'll get into trouble if you underreact, but you'll never get into trouble if you overreact, at least not initially. And you talk about this race to the bottom, or the race to predicting doom among public health bureaucrats, and the Doherty scenario predicting that worst case 25,000 dead, and everybody reacting on that basis and making decisions on that basis that had, in hindsight, awful unintended or intended perhaps, or obvious consequences. How bad was that managerial groupthink that was going on, that poor quality management thinking? Were you surprised by the poor quality of that? How bad was it? I'm talking about not just your own colleagues, I'm talking about the state premiers as well from the other side of politics. So 2 elements to your question. We had distorted medical evidence that was politically cherry-picked
and dragged Cabinet in confidence so that it would never be released. But secondly, there was a complete paucity of economic modelling around COVID. An example of that was, well, which sectors do we really need to shut down that has an impact on COVID spread, and which ones have no impact whatsoever? The outcome of that, Damien, was twofold. We've got 25,000 excess deaths over and above a 5-year average that might have been predicted in a normal flu season that can't be explained by dying with or of COVID. 3/4 of these deaths are purely because we shut down hospital services to the frail and elderly. All they wanted was to get their blood sugar checked or their heart checked, and we shut down hospitals for elective work simply because we were fearful of being overrun. The modelling showed that we were not going to be overrun. If we were, it would be in one hospital in an outbreak. So we will have deaths, Damien, for the next 5 years in excess of what we should have had because elderly patients miss their chronic disease care in hospital. And the second problem we have when you spend $500 billion into the economy that didn't all need to be spent is we have the current inflationary environment. I mean, we blame Ukraine for supply line issues, but fundamentally it was the global COVID spend that led to this massive monetary supply that's causing interest rate hikes. So, who are the families that are going to be defaulting when their fixed interest terms come to an end in the middle of the year? We can point back to this massive financial spend, doubling payments to job seekers who had no increase in cost of living, trucking money into, rightly, JobKeeper payments, but never recovering any of it. My point at the time, as early as April, was why not lend before you spend? We have a HEC system that is the envy of the world. Why not lend money to both individuals, families and businesses that needed it through COVID?
Yep.
And of course, if they're wildly successful or completely unaffected and their pre-tax income goes through the roof anyway, well, they should be paying it back as part of their tax return, and this would have given us breathing space and time. The same money going out, but most of it would have come back. We knew within 6 months this wasn't going to be a deep and long recession, and the policies were too inflexible to allow that to occur.
So essentially what we've done is, through this overreaction in the management process, we have set ourselves up for 5 years of economic pain, and worse, 5 years of excess deaths beyond what we would normally have. It's bordering on, well, I would go so far as to say that it's pretty criminally disastrous kind of leadership and management, with all due respect. I know you were personally banging your head against a bit of a brick wall. Your colleagues who were more senior than you in the ministry were not paying attention to you. You've always been a bit of a maverick and an outsider, Andrew, and we thank you for that because we need more of that in politics. I want to discuss that a little bit later too, why we don't have enough of that in politics today. But it seems that our politicians operate like bureaucrats instead of representatives of the people. That we have this bureaucratic, technocratic class in our political landscape as well as our bureaucracies, and so it's very hard to kind of be a voice when you're going against this massive wave. And as we said, the bias towards playing it safe, being overcautious, without consideration to overcautious leading to serious problems down the track.
I mean, the tension, of course, in what you've just said is that fundamentally we've learnt from the state elections where mostly Labor governments were returned with increased majorities through this period, that voters are fundamentally happy being cocooned. And they don't see their increasing tax payments supporting larger and larger technocratic bureaucracies as much of a problem. They can't see that link. And it raises the question that I'm increasingly speaking about now, which is, what are our political values and what are our personal values? Because certainly I'm feeling that my side of politics has lost sight of that. The fundamental values conversation for young Australians who are going to be paying both the economic price for this, asking why they can't afford a home and continue not to be able to. The LNP has to be able to reconnect what matters. And as long as you have this larger and larger bureaucracy with long-term wage agreements struck by Labor governments to protect public servants and secure their vote, the LNP is between a rock and a hard place. And we really have to very aggressively be trying to understand whether young people see this as a problem or not. And if they do, how we reconnect with them. And this will be a big challenge for David Crisafulli leading into October 2024.
In Queensland, he's the Queensland LNP opposition leader, I should point out for our viewers interstate. That's the state of Queensland for our international viewers. But Andrew, I think you've hit on something there, because the Queensland state election was late 2020, is that correct, or 21? I can't remember, late 2020. We then had the WA election, both of which saw massive wins for Labor on the back of premiers that were going out every day and just saying, you know, we'll keep you safe, we'll keep you safe. People were afraid. You could understand why there was this big swing to them. That then spooked the Liberal Party. It prevented anybody from coming out and saying, well, hang on a minute, we need to be more balanced in our approach. Anybody who did, and you probably experienced it, was shut down, probably internally. And so we wound up with a situation where politically it became, well, we must just go with the maximum lockdowns. We must, people, as you said, want to be cocooned. They want the big state to step in here. Let's get even tougher. I got that in the initial stages, but why did we see such a lingering of that support? Even after people saw that we'd gone too far, that Dan Andrews in Victoria in particular, he was the next to go to an election, I think, and then of course won quite well. Although he did go down a little bit, but he basically did pretty well. And then the federal election, of course. So it seems that the public are still of the view that this was all, fairly well handled, or the big, heavy, big state approach. It was the Liberal Party, of course, but it was Liberal Party going against liberal values and not respecting those fundamental liberal values you were talking about. Was all of that? Does all of that surprise you? I mean, it does. We're at a point now where you would think there would be a bit of a wake up, a bit of a backlash, and we're still not seeing that, particularly among the young, who have to pay for this more than anyone.
There's a bit of COVID timing to this too, Damien. So, of course, Stephen Marshall lost in his state election bid for Labor.
He was Liberal.
Which was the first state government to lose. And the question is why? And the answer is that he was a progressive person who believed in opening up. He was on a unity ticket with Scott Morrison and really never departed from Scott's direction as a real team player. But in attempting to open up South Australia, they were able to run a ramping campaign at hospitals, which I think was a key element to his defeat. And of course, Scott Morrison going to election in 2022 was after the COVID boogeyman was no longer out there. So we'd vaccinated the population, and then they had the luxury of thinking about other issues that infuriated them, both personal issues around Scott Morrison and anything but COVID. So had we had a federal election in the middle of COVID, we probably would have had the same successful outcome. But as soon as the public emerges from under the doona, they then start looking around and be quite critical of their leaders, and the federal Liberal Party was on the wrong end of that.
Young Australians, of course, had the benefit of the handouts, of Josh Frydenberg's handouts, and it became a Netflix holiday for some, while others were suffering. Small business people were being crushed. It was a really uneven punishment that went out from this thing. And we saw a lot of people actually, particularly the young, benefiting with these payments. So the economic pain has been kicked down the road. They're feeling it now. Do you think that we'll see a bit of a wake up in the way they look at things?
I think they now have this huge private and public debt baked in. We're at the position now where even the LNP has resigned itself to not being able to pay off national debt anymore. So the game now shifts to protecting your credit rating as a government. And as I've always said, and often I was a lone voice in the federal party room for the coalition, it's about not leaving Labor with huge amounts of money to spend in the coffers, because as we learnt, Kevin Rudd just did that for political advantage. So we almost have to leave Labor in dire economic circumstances to prevent more unreasonable spending. We'll have to see if that works.
Okay.
But Queensland obviously is the next state that we'll be having a look at. And as my home state, I have to figure out in the next 12 months, how do I refocus my party onto 30 to 40-year-old young families that worried about their kids, worried about personal safety. They're on the sidelines of junior sport, and they're making values assessments about their leadership. And increasingly, it's the LNP that will fall foul of this judgment, as they have previously, if we can't reinvent what a libertarian small government approach looks like. It is fundamentally makes a huge amount of sense if it's articulated well, but we need to keep up with the times. And at the moment, we're getting flanked by the Teal attack, and the LNP has this work ahead of them because they virtually have no membership under the age of, between 30 and 50, a huge scotoma or blind spot within the party. So the conversation can't happen. And we find ourselves, with the under 30s are primarily university students on campus having fun. So without being too critical of my young Liberal friends, where is the voice for this missing demographic in the right wing of Australian politics? And these are the genuine forgotten people. Okay, yeah. Sending your kids to low-fee independent schools, listening to FM radio, barely time to sit down and watch the news. But increasingly they feel safe and secure with a no surprises Labor government. It appears to be a position that's baked in. And this is the LNP challenge in Queensland to change that.
But we keep ironing out the pain by softening the blows, by handing out money, by taking on more debt. We're now at a point where we've got, nationally at least, if you add in the state debt, we're over $1 trillion and more. We've got one state that's virtually broke. This is a very unhealthy state of affairs. As you say, it's very important that we keep the credit ratings up, because the credit ratings determine the interest rates that people will pay to lend us money as a country. And we've got that AAA rating. We've got to keep it there. I think in most cases, it's AAA. But we keep those low interest rates. But that interest rates are going up generally. So when you've got $1 trillion worth of debt, if interest rates average out at, if the average interest rate on that debt, I think it was 2.85% that Scott Morrison said it was before the election, if that goes to 5%, 5% of $1 trillion is, if my math is correct, is a lot of money, $50 billion, right? And that's just the interest, right? You want to pay down the principal over 20 years, that's another $50 billion. So there's $100 billion, billion with a B, that's 1,000 million. And we've got, I think our government spending's around $650 billion a year. So we're talking about 1/6 of the entire government spending every year, just going to paying down that debt we've already accumulated. Who pays for that? People aged under 40.
That's right. So 2 quick points there, Damien. The first is that, young people don't feel this debt, and they live in a world of private debt now and on credit card spending and buy now, pay later. So they're quite comfortable with this. The second is that fundamentally, if we have a strong commodity economy like Australia, with, on a relative sense, less debt per capita than other countries like Europe and the US, then we won't be the first to fall. And if the whole global system collapses, we all go down. But in a relative sense, we don't have as much debt, although it's increased relatively more than other countries. But we're still a very safe option for investment, and that's probably where we'll sit. The other point you just touched on there is that what federal Labor has done is politicise the RBA with this bizarre appointment of people of limited bandwidth to be giving advice on interest rates. That's code for the Labor government determined to force the RBA to lower interest rates when they otherwise wouldn't for political reasons. And what that means is that investment continues to flood into housing, and so it's not going to go up. It may well go up once, but once Labor gets their hands on the RBA, they'll be forcing rates down, and that will further overinflate the housing market. And without getting too deep into this, Australia spends way too much of its dollar in the lazy assets of housing that are not productive. And what we want is a nation that can transform our fabulous commodity endowment into productive value-added assets. But why would you do it if you've got a government keeping interest rates down, further flooding and inflating the housing sector?
Andrew, some say the move, I want to get back onto the COVID stuff, but you're absolutely right there. But some say the move by the Morrison government to set up the National Cabinet was fundamentally a bad idea. What was your take on that? He couldn't get control or consensus with the 8 state and territory leaders.
I've got to be honest, it was a genius. It was a masterstroke at the time. The question is, of course, how do you use the facility that was National Cabinet?
Was it your idea, was it?
May have just, it was Scott Morrison's idea.
I'm joking. I just...
Yeah, and it, having disintegrated over time, we tend to retrospectively judge Morrison on that. But it was good for a couple of reasons. I mean, one is it effectively became a war cabinet. But secondly, Morrison was aware that he was a tax and transfer government in Canberra, but not a service provider. He actually was able to unload a lot of the risk. So all of those mortifying disasters in quarantine were all carried by state governments that were responsible. And just to touch on this, the movement restrictions that were so cruel in, well, not so much in WA, they're an island effectively, but Queensland's treatment of the New South Wales border was heartbreaking, and it showed a new side to Australian community sentiment that we supported Anastasia through some of these disgraceful decisions about allowing people across the border purely to attend a funeral, heartbreaking, turning Australians into stateless overseas residents who couldn't get home to their country.
Well, it was insane. It was insane. I mean, let's call a spade a spade. It was utterly insane. It was a hideous breach of civil liberties for no good reason other than politics. It felt like McGowan, Andrews and Palaszczuk were running the show, and I think that's why Morrison got punished, or partly why Morrison got punished at the polls. Do you think that setting up that national cabinet was a genuine attempt to be consultative and work together on the crisis? Or was it simply a Scott Morrison sidestep to avoid having to lead and take the blame alone if anything went wrong?
No, I think it was the former, but then he realised fairly quickly that this effectively running entity that everyone was glued to watching every night or every fortnight that they met allowed him to push that blame on. And let me just say, you know, the limit of what the states had to do through this was two things. It was contact trace for cases, and even states like Victoria ended up doing that on bits of paper. And secondly, all they had to do was transport international arrivals, citizens coming home from the airport to a hotel, and keep them there for 14 days and push food through a door. And they screwed that up. Or
if you're worried about infection, build a place in the Northern Territory and land the planes there. But to deny Australian citizens the fundamental right to return to their own country devalued our passport forever. You know, I know Australians now who are seeking alternative citizenships because they're freaked out by the fact that they were abandoned essentially by their own country. And I'm a former expat. There are a lot of expats around the world with children. We are a big exporting nation when it comes to managerial talent, and we need to look after our expats.
And we didn't. I mean, we left them stranded. And what I learnt is that the average Australian, from what I could see, said if you're wealthy enough to be overseas, it's your problem. I was stunned by how little concern there was in the mainstream for these stranded families. Many of them young families had closed up their leases, headed to the airport, had flights cancelled, completely isolated in second and third world economies, and no plan to get them home. All you need.
Exactly. And I'll just add that it is managerial class, not high senior executive class. We're talking teachers. We're talking nurses. We're talking junior doctors, junior dentists, accountants, etc. Lots of middle class Aussies stuck overseas with a passport that was potentially valueless, and in some cases stuck in India in the middle of a pandemic with a very poor hospital system. I think that was a blot on our nation that's just inexcusable. But anyway, a lot of other things occurred at home, closer to home, that were equally bad, as we said. You wrote rather eloquently, I must say, that quote, science was second to precautionary principle. Chief health officers were used as political pawns, and the politicians were trying to sound like public health officials. That's pretty damning stuff.
Yeah, the boundaries were completely merged. These body doubles, effectively, chief health officers were riveted or stapled to the side of their own premiers. But you just got the sense that it had all been politically filtered before they spoke. And that was disappointing. We needed separation at this time, Damien. The other point I'm arguing for is economic advice that's independent. And we bring these two together into health economic analysis of how to manage a pandemic. We had the medical coming in from the wrong quarters. And I just want to keep bagging my public health colleagues, but we had private owners of PCR testing machines on expert advisory groups telling Canberra not to allow in the rapid antigen tests because they were unreliable, because the advisory group members owned the PCR machines and were making tens of millions of dollars on those tests that we didn't need to do. We're doing these highly precise PCR tests when every other country had transitioned to RAT tests. So if I'm segueing to the next topic, the mistakes that were made from Canberra was an over-reliance on AstraZeneca, probably because we believed it was a non-profit vaccine and we could manufacture it onshore.
Yeah.
And that hurt us badly. And then politically, it was reinforced when we screwed up rapid antigen testing by not holding to one side this distorted advice coming out of private pathology owners of the PCR machines. And so when we ran out of RAT tests at the end of 2021, voters then were reminded that we'd made quite a few mistakes along the way. It was awful timing going into Christmas. and it meant the only chance Canberra had of having a federal election was as deep as possible into 2022. It's what we did, and it still didn't save us.
So irrespective of the position that people might take on vaccines, we have a wide variety of views out there on that in the show. But on the question of mandates and the ethics of that, the ethics of effectively forced or highly persuasive and coercive requirements for people to be injected with what we now know was a relatively untested technology, new medical technology. Your thoughts on the mandate in retrospect and the ethics of that?
Sure. Look, and for viewers, I'll try and distill a very complicated area. We had no long-term data, but you don't ever have long-term data for a new treatment. I think we were reasonable in doing the assessment of these vaccines as fast as possible by doing concurrent testing. So they'd start phase 1 of early testing, but they'd also start phase 2 and terminate it if phase 1 didn't work out. They did all of that correctly. My main focus is on the mandating of a vaccine that in hindsight now may have net benefit for some parts of the population, certainly negative benefit. We had young people getting vaccinated for no real net benefit, but to try and help someone else in the community. And young people will wake up to that very early. But these mandates were two things. They were not really proportional. So we were sacking people who worked from home simply because corporations wanted to virtue signal publicly that they were a pro-vaccine entity. And that was, it's ridiculous to just sack people for this. The second point is that what we should have done here was use it as a last resort, but we in fact weren't. We weren't doing other sensible stuff, but we leapt straight to the mandates because it was politically good messaging for the masses. And the last point to make is that, we made it so hard for people who weren't vaccinated, who were young and healthy. But at the same time, we had people who had been technically vaccinated, but we know that about 20% of them don't seroconvert, Damien. So it's a complicated point. You actually don't produce the antibodies in every case. So people who thought they were vaccinated were actually walking around quite unprotected and likely to have the same risk of getting COVID as an unvaccinated person. So the vaccine was not a magic bullet. It slightly reduced transmission and the severity of disease, made a huge difference in the elderly. So I just supported the science. You need to be vaccinated if you're working in aged care, frontline healthcare, or with the disabled who have health or chronic disease issues, utterly reasonable. But as you moved out of there, for instance, for a copper on the beat, well, he's likely to get into a scuffle and get very close to those that he's detaining. So they fell on frontline police being vaccinated. But after that, this decision, and I have to say Scott Morrison was, despite my best efforts, was in favour of it, was that it's a property law issue. So whoever owns the property can decide the vaccine requirements. So you had every barista on every street corner having a different view on mandates, and unleashing business to make their own calls on this is completely contrary to public health advice, which is that you follow the evidence. And I worked internally and politely and firmly and had no success, only to have 2 or 3 of my Senate colleagues, incredibly brave, who basically shirt-fronted Morrison until he changed his mind and started to, for the first time, say that we need to be getting on with life and not sacking people for getting vaccinated. But by then it was too late in his term to save him. Yeah,
it was the wrong decision. And the argument at the time for it from all of the self-righteous pundits that we have out there on the other side, more self-righteous than even I am on this side of things, it was saying, it's a community issue. It's for the social good. It's the fact that you can pass this on to other people. It's true that to a small extent there is some benefit in transmission, and I'm all for science and all for vaccines and all for medicine. I am very, very libertarian when it comes to the question of mandating medicine, though, on the community. You have to have an incredibly strong public health reason to impose a vaccine, especially a young one with new technology, on a population like we did. Do you think moving forward we need to enshrine in some sort of legislation some kind of, pandemic response limitations so that we don't see this hideous deprivation of civil liberties and this outrageous imposition put onto people against their will?
I was involved in developing the first pandemic plan for Australia as John Howard's public health advisor back in 2004. That's when the first one was designed by the Department of Health. I don't see that as the solution, Damien. I'd rather a proper royal commission, but no state or jurisdiction will do it because they were all complicit and benefited ultimately from how they managed COVID. But a royal commission would flush this out, and if we're serious, we should continue pushing for it. But I can't see any major party supporting that. Look, the other point is I do need to make this observation that my medical colleagues in general absolutely detest anti-vaxxers. And it's a seething hatred that seeps through into the public health sector and was transmitted to politicians at the time. And look, I don't count anti-vaxxers necessarily as friends or allies or whatever, but for their own reason, everyone has a fundamental, autonomy about personal elements like getting vaccinated, unless it's a life-threatening circumstance. We knew that 80% of Australians would proudly march up and expose their shoulder for a jab. And we needed to get to 90 for herd immunity. And the thought never crossed anyone's mind that you pay for risk, which is when you get to 80 and you want it to be higher, we should have just offered people a dinner voucher or a slight tax concession to come in and get your vaccine. We'd have been at 90% in no time, and no one needed to lose the bread on their table, their job, or their ability to send their children to school. But that's what happened because we didn't think creatively about what other ways to bump up our vaccination levels if we needed to. We're at 80 easily in a canter, and probably 85 with a public health campaign. And a tiny incentive to get vaccinated at that point would have easily taken us well over 90 without this disgraceful mass sacking of teachers and nurses. Just for a moment here, we're listening in the city. If you're out in the small regional town, it's one teacher out of a 4-teacher school. This throws into service delivery for that small school an absolute catastrophe. You can't replace, there's no teacher to go there, and this other teacher's sitting at home. And then at the end of it is they decree that they're going to lose 17 weeks of wages, all because the public health advice told us that schools were not even the focus of COVID spread in the first place. But they couldn't see through it, and they just rushed in under Anastasia Palaszczuk and other state governments to these mandates. And I feel so sad for state public servants because they didn't have the ability to take their case to Fair Work Australia because they're under state legislation. Everyone else did have that opportunity, and I'm glad they did.
Okay. I might just point out too that when you say anti-vaxxers, there were the radical anti-vaxxers who don't like medicine, don't like science, don't like vaccines, period. Then you've got the anti-COVID vaccine group who just were sceptical, have concerns about this new technology, the mRNA technology in particular, were worried about the speed of the process, even though, as you say, the process was undertaken following normal guidelines. And then you had the anti-mandate crowd like me, who were just appalled that government, and I think you say these public health decisions are difficult. I would go so far as to say government has no place. You guys have no place in interfering with our freedom and our liberty, and the Liberal Party is supposed to be the party that stands up for that liberty. I want to talk generally in that case a little bit more, Andrew, about where the Liberal Party is heading, where liberty is heading in Australia, where we're heading with big government. You mentioned before that we learned that people quite like big government, and I have to, as someone who leans classical liberal and makes no attempt to hide that on this show, we are in a situation right now where we have empowered government in a sense through this process. They've seen that people are willing to follow, that the majority, I am in the minority, we know that. That's why I'm not on a major network. We are definitely in the minority. Where do we go from here? And how does it's easy for the Liberal Democrats, the United Australia Party, One Nation. They're small minor parties. They can stand up and shout loudly. The Liberal Party must capture the majority. How does it do that moving forward, given this? I feel for David Crisafulli to a certain extent, and the other Liberal leaders, and Dominic Perrottet, and maybe not so much Matt Keane. But yeah, how do you see it?
Look, quite simply, the fundamental virtues of right-wing politics, of libertarianism and small government and aspiration will always be attractive to voters if we can communicate it properly. I commend Graham Haycroft. He heads up the Red Union, setting up Queensland teacher and nurses unions. And what he's doing is talking about voting hospital staff onto a staff board to advise and monitor the actions of of the bureaucrat-heavy, academic-heavy and political appointment-heavy current boards. I like his idea that we decentralise departments of education out of high-rise buildings in the city where everyone's got a safe job looking at projects and various elements of education, and moving those staff back onto school grounds where they're actually engaged with children face-to-face as education bureaucrats, helping with school pick up and drop off and supporting teachers more to give them time off to be able to do their lesson planning and professional development. I mean, we need to be looking at police having more local control. These elements are attractive. Aspiration is attractive. I think we need to reduce the size of government through gentle attrition rather than maybe Campbell Newman's
rapid approach, maybe slightly too
incisive
rapid.
approach.
Yeah, I think he'd admit that too.
Yeah, that's right. I think in retrospect we'd agree. But no, we can still win this. But are we listening to young people? Am I listening to young people? I like Tucker Carlson's recent video yesterday saying that fundamentally we all operate in a small group of people we trust, with whom we speak the truth. How big can we make these islands and extend that, because it will never be extinguished. Fundamental truth won't be, and the fewer people who speak clear and undoubted truth, the more we need to look out for them. They are the black swans. When one economist says interest rates are not going to go up and the other 99 say it will, I want to know why that person is saying. Well, so
not every outlier.
Not
every outlier is worth listening to, or at least following. Not every outlier is. There are crackpots out there, but we should listen to those swans because it is hard to speak out. And if they are speaking out, they're taking a risk. So they at least need to be heard, and we at least need to consider carefully what they're saying. And there just isn't enough of that in my industry, in the media. It's appalling, the groupthink at the moment in Australia, which is why I started this show. It's very concerning. Obviously in politics it's concerning as well. Education, and we've got a lot of cultural work to do. Andrew, we are out of time, unfortunately, but I want to thank you for coming on the show. We need politicians with your skill set. As I said, you've got a Masters of Public Administration from the Harvard Kennedy School of Government. You're a doctor, and you bring a lot of past political experience. Are you going to run again? I've got to ask the question.
Well, we've talked a lot about where the LNP has to go over the next 12 months, and I'm respectfully feeding this kind of information into our leader. I would argue we need a little bit more mongrel and a little bit less poodle in politics. And if I can contribute to tipping that balance back that way, I'll keep doing it. And there's plenty of challenges out there. There's lots of time out there, and there's lots of supporters out there watching. So thank you, everyone. And by the way, my book gets launched next Thursday morning at the Conservative Club in Brisbane. For over breakfast, so get in touch if you'd like to be at the Tattersalls Club next Thursday, the 4th of May. How's that for a shameless plug?
Well, shameless plug is warranted, and we're putting the book on the screen as we speak, so I do hope people that buy it and read it. It's a fantastic read. Andrew, you also have been the victim of a reputation attack, which I'm not going to repeat or get into. I'm just going to say that this seems to be a problem for people of a certain demographic, shall we say, at the moment in public life, that there are vicious people out there that want to actively destroy reputations, that focus on a particular individual, that create false allegations and drive those false allegations by using media techniques and making things look bad. I did a deep dive on that on the other side in 2021 on a story on the ABC 730 report, which was nothing but an absolute takedown job with people using people that were politically active, people that were known to the ABC. I find a lot of this very concerning that's going on in our country right now. And I just want to say, that it's good to see that your response to this, your defamation, you've been cleared, vindicated completely on every allegation levelled against you. Is that correct?
Sure. Absolutely. It was all thrown before the federal court, and the truth and honest opinion defences were withdrawn by the media entity prior to a very satisfactory confidential settlement. So the message there is we don't have to hate the whole media, but the excesses that we saw in what I refer to as the gender panic period under Scott Morrison, I think we've passed that peak, and those few have been singled out, punished appropriately. And if I've improved slightly the media landscape, where there's less rush to judgment and a more assiduous effort to get both sides of a story before publishing, that is an improvement that I'm proud to be part of.
And it was, let's face it, it was an attack on Scott Morrison. It was a constructed narrative by his political opponents to say we're going to create an image of this guy in the next 2 years that he is insensitive to women's issues, and we're going to use everything we can and throw everything we can at that, including the kitchen sink, and that's exactly what they did. And unfortunately, you were the victim of it, or one of the victims of it. I hope it never happens again. I hope the effect has been that you've your defamation action, and I'm sorry you had to go through that, and thank you for fighting for the rest of us.
I think we've left the media landscape slightly improved. It's a great icing on the cake, and looking forward to moving forward. And state politics is absolutely where I'm focused, because I think this is the generational challenge, is a non-Labor government in Queensland after no consecutive wins for 3 decades. We need to fix that, and the chance is October next year.
All right. Andrew Lemming, thank you very, very much for joining us on The Other Side Interviews. And that's it for our show.
Thanks again, Damien.
Great having you. That's it for our show for this week. We hope that you will join us every Tuesday night at 6 p.m. Our show, The Other Side Interviews, will stream here on ADH TV. And then, of course, it's available on demand for you to watch or listen to anytime you like on ADH or your favourite podcast platform. Also, don't forget The Other Side Australia, our main show, our weekly summary wrap of the news of the week for you from a classical Liberal perspective. You can catch that dropping every Friday night, streaming every Friday night on ADH TV, but it's also out there on all the podcast platforms as well. So I'll catch you Friday night for The Other Side Australia. Till then, take care.